Okay, guys, welcome back. Just getting the stream going, and we have another, say, 10 minutes basically until I get into the lecture part. But nice to be with you. Glad you're watching, and just get comfortable, and we'll get started in 10 minutes for the video lecture. Thank you, guys. Hey, gentlemen, good to see you there. Hope you've been well. Gentlemen, Santino, welcome, guys. Good, good. I know it's a busy time in the semester, so I'm sure you've got a lot on your plate, but yeah, I'm good. Just kind of coasting into the last few weeks of the semester, trying to stay focused on all these good topics. It's good to be with you guys. Good to see you, Carson. Thank you. Hello. Okay, 9 minutes to go. Hey, Jennifer. Good to see you. I'm good. I hope you're doing well too. Hi, Elena. Welcome back. Yeah, it's just been more of the same last week, basically. I've been just, teaching all these different classes that I've got, um, trying to stay active, been doing some workouts like I always do. Nothing really, nothing new under the sun, I guess, but it's good. Looking forward to the summer. We still got 3 weeks, basically. Hey, Nick, welcome back. Oh, I've got a lot right now, Jennifer. I got 5 classes at Cal State Fullerton. So I got 4 in person and then this one online. I have an online class at Orange Coast College, Community College at Costa Mesa, and then I have also have a class at Chapman. So yeah, it's a lot, but it's okay. I'm used to that. I've been doing this for years, so it's all pretty much automatic almost at this point. Another 6.5 minutes to get started. Try to get a little additional light. 1 second. Turning my brightness on the screen up just slightly. Okay, hey there, Jasmine. Welcome back. Okay, still got 5 minutes till we get started, but nice to be with you guys, of course. Okay, all right. Time keeps ticking away. We've got about 4 minutes till we start. Okay, 3 minutes to go. Just got our little countdown. Anthony, hello. Oh yeah, so no worries about that, Anthony. Thanks. Yeah, I got your message. I thought you would probably just check the announcements and see. It was basically a day for you to try and watch that little movie that I gave you a link for. It's the equivalent of like a movie film day, one day of our semester, like you sometimes have in your in-person classes. So that was the big point of that. But no worries at all. Glad you sent me a message. Hi, Jasmine. Hi, Tyler. Welcome back, all you guys. Good to see you. We got our crew showing up. No worries. Thanks, Anthony. Appreciate the message, though. That was good. No worries. Sandra, welcome back. Good to see you. Okay, we're down to the last 90 seconds. We'll get started soon. Rosemary, welcome back. Good to see you too. Mary Jane, hey there. Just another minute. Violet, hello. Okay. Well then, everybody, pretty much now getting to 4 p.m. So just going to get started. Thanks again, everyone, for being here today and for being present at the meeting. Appreciate it as always. So let's just kind of get into gear and get organized. We were here with our last live stream a week ago. In between then and now, as I had mentioned before, as you see in the syllabus, there was this film, The Speciesism, that's kind of like a supplement to the unit on animals and the ethics of animals. So I sent you guys the link for it. I hope some of you are able to follow that link and get to watch the video on your leisure time when you've had a free, 90 minutes or whatever. It's an interesting movie only because it's like a documentary made by Mark DeVry. He was a college student at the time, and he did a series of interviews and other kind of um, documentary clips where he talks to people that are interested in this debate over like animal welfare or animal rights, or whether we have any moral obligations to non-human animals, especially animals that are used for human consumption in factory farms for food or for meat. One of the great things about the movie is that he actually interviews different authors that are in our book that we've either studied or that we will study. So like he talked to Peter Singer. So if you were able to watch this, you would have seen some of those interviews with, the well-known current day Australian philosopher, Peter Singer, and he expresses his views on the topic. There's also some interview sections in the same documentary with Tom Regan. Regan is the author that we will study and focus on in today's lecture. So, it's nice to just be able to see a little bit of live footage of those individuals that are talking about their different perspectives. It's definitely a movie that kind of pushes a little bit more onto the pro-animal side of the moral debate. But it's interesting, and, it's just another way to get some multimedia into the class and sort of change up the format a little. The other thing I wanted to make sure we all were clear about is I did post the essay prompts for the second essay assignment. Anyone here can confirm that you've seen them. I just want to make sure that you've had a chance to look. I'm going to talk to you about the different format and content guidelines right now. So while we're here in the chat, yeah, thanks Jasmine and the others for letting me know. Let me just go over it. I'm going to read some of the stuff from the prompt to you, and then I'm just going to go over what I think are the most essential points to keep in mind. So I'm looking at it on a different window in my computer laptop here. So let me just kind of make sure I've got good visibility to see the whole thing. Okay, so here's what we've got. One second, a little extra movement. Okay, yeah, so it says, Essay 2, your assignment. You have to write a 3 to 4 page double-spaced essay with normal margins in 12-point font. So just on the format, it's the same as the first essay. It's a 3 to 4 page general guideline of length. It's supposed to be double spaced, normal size margins, and it's in 12-point font. It's okay to go beyond 4 pages. The upper boundary in the page length guidance is flexible, so it's no problem if you feel that you need a little more space to finish up your thoughts or to complete all of your different analysis. Less than 3 would probably be a bit deficient, just because it's hard for, I think, any student to comprehensively report in a substantive way on all the topic information in the prompt in less than 3. So try to make sure that it's minimum 3, but definitely it can go over 4 if you'd like. So that's why it says 3 to 4 pages. Obviously, you can't use any resources outside of the class. So you can use a book, you can use the lectures, your notes, the video that I've sent you, but you can't use like anything else, whether it's generative AI or, of course, you can't submit work that you didn't write. That's just a clear guideline, and that's just a basic requirement. So make sure you keep it that way. It says here it's due on or before 11:59 on Tuesday, May 6th. So just as you did with the first essay, you will send me your attached document via email, or if you like, you could use Canvas inbox, but just properly attach it. My preferred formats would be either PDF or Word file, like a document X file. You send it to rvulich@fullerton.edu if you're doing the email, and if you use Canvas inbox, then just use that modality if you prefer. I extended the deadline just slightly, and let me just, because I'm looking at the other window, I want to make sure I say hi to all you guys that are showing up. Hey there, Poria, Amanda, and Daniel. Anyway, just reviewing the prompt and the guidelines for the paper. I was just saying that I extended the deadline slightly. It was originally listed as due on the Thursday of May 1st. I went ahead and decided that it's little bit better for us to get some additional margin of time, just to make sure that we have a nice safe buffer around when we finish the animal unit and then when it's due. So in total, it's 19 days away from now that it's due. Today's April the 17th as I'm speaking, and 19 days from now is May the 6th. So it'll be due then, just emailing it to me, and it's worth 25% of your final grade. The first essay was 15%, the midterm was 30, so that's a total of 45% of your course value. This is another 25, which brings us up to 70% of the course value, and then the final that we have at the end will be the last 30. So it's a significant portion of the grade. That's why you want to make sure you do your best to get a good submission in. Now, anyway, there's only one prompt choice this time, and it's all about animals. So here's what it says. So explain the moral theory of Kantianism and utilitarianism, and then, using these theories and the authors that we have read concerning animals, describe the Kantian position on our duties to animals, and then describe how a utilitarian can take either a pro or an anti-animal position in the debate. So before I move on to the last sentence of the prompt, let me just make sure that first part's clear. So two things that you have to kind of do in the paper. One thing you have to do is give a general overview and summary of the two major moral theories that we studied in the class. So you have to report on Kantian ethical principles and what they are, and then tell us what utilitarianism is all about. So, for example, in describing utilitarianism, you would say that, author John Stuart Mill presented this ethical framework according to which the right action is whichever action creates the most overall happiness for the greatest number. And it's a consequentialist theory. It says that any actions are permissible as long as they are a means to the end of maximizing utility. You would just go ahead and give that basic description. You can give further detail. You could talk about how some say that there are criticisms to it, like there's the theory for swine because it's all about pleasure, but Mill thinks that there's higher and lower pleasures that distinguish us from animals. Anyway, that would be your kind of synopsis of a utilitarian viewpoint. You'd also then talk about what the Kantian ethical system is. So you would say that according to Kant, it's based on duty rather than maximizing happiness. He says that we should act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law, regardless of the consequences. And he says that the moral law can be expressed through the categorical imperative. You'd want to talk about both versions of the categorical imperative. The first one is that actions have to be based on maxims that could coherently be willed to be universal laws without logical contradiction or without a contradiction in the will of the person, meaning that they wouldn't want that to be the universal law. And then also, you can give examples of that. You also have to mention the second version. It's actually quite important to focus on emphasizing that second version of the categorical imperative, the one that says that you should never treat a person as a means to an end. We'll talk about Kant's specific view on animals on Tuesday in the next lecture, but basically what you'll see, and I'm just kind of previewing it for you now, is he's going to ultimately argue that though you have to treat people as an end and never as a means, he doesn't say that about animals. He says that because animals lack rationality and they don't have the ability to be morally self-governing, that they can be used as a means to an end, and the end is man. So you can use an animal as food or for clothing, for leather or for fur, and that doesn't violate any rights. They don't hold rights because they are not rational creatures, so they could be used as a means. But anyway, the second version of the categorical imperative does say that you're never supposed to treat people as a means to an end. So you want to make sure that you just explain what the Kantian and the utilitarian basic moral principles are, and then after that you'll dive into this work on the moral debate concerning animals. The Kantian position on our duties to animals is the one that I was just sort of gesturing towards a moment ago. He says that we don't have any direct duties to the animals, but he is willing to grant that we may have some indirect duties to them, like, for example, to not be unnecessarily cruel or abusive, because if we do that, he thinks it's not really a violation of the animals' rights because they don't have any, but he says if we do that, if we indulge in sadistic or brutal behavior to animals without proper cause, then we could sort of develop habits of behavior in our own person that we would then ultimately direct towards humans where it would matter. So he says we kind of should have an indirect duty to practice kindness on the animals so that we don't descend into savagery as we deal with other human beings. He thinks that if you just kind of, are cruel and you torture animals and you abuse them for no reason, then you're probably going to become a sort of brutal person that becomes desensitized to violence against other people. So the Kantian position on our duties to animals is that they don't have rights, they're not members of the moral community because they lack rationality, but he still thinks, so that means that we can use them as a means to an end, but he still does think that we have some kind of indirect duty to not be unnecessarily or needlessly cruel to them. Even if we do use them as a means, we shouldn't be excessively cruel because that would cause us to form habits that would then spill over into the treatment of humans. It also says describe the utilitarian position and how it can be either pro or anti-animal. So one pro-animal utilitarian that you definitely have to talk about is Singer. Singer's a utilitarian, and I'll summarize his view more comprehensively in a moment after I talk about the prompt. But if you may remember, Singer said that we should give the same weight to the same interests no matter what being has it, even if it's a being that's of a different species. So the common interest that we share with animals, according to Singer, was an interest in avoiding pain and suffering. And he thinks that if we gave the same respect to the animal desire to avoid pain and suffering as we did to the human, then we wouldn't be able to justify certain practices that we engage in either individually or, collectively or culturally. For example, he thinks that if we don't give equal weight to the same interest of animals just because they're a different species, that would be equivalent to speciesism, which is like a form of discrimination against the similar interests of others only because they are of a different species as you. He thinks that, for example, the use of animals for food or for experiments is an instance of speciesism, because if you consider the conditions that animals suffer in factory farms in order to generate meat for us, this sacrifices major significant interests of the animal to be free of pain and suffering for the sake of trivial non-essential interests to humans, because consumption of meat is not necessary for health or longevity. So we're now balancing, the vital interests of not suffering and being subjected to pain on the animal side to our insignificant, trivial, unessential interests in the pleasures of the palate. So it's not for the sake of pure survival that we do eat these animals, at least. Now, there's also the potential for an anti-animal utilitarian position. A person could think, and Carl Cohen kind of makes this case, that actually the value in terms of the output for total happiness that we gain from using the animals is so substantial that it outweighs all of the pain that they suffer. So you could argue that maybe the development of certain kind of biomedical experiments that allow us to create cures or therapeutic treatments or other technologies that are used, that are developed by using animals as experimental subjects, that causes such great, immense value to the human world, and even some animals too are benefited by these developments, that somehow is more total happiness on balance than the alternative scenario in which we forego such experiments and other things and leave the animals alone, but we don't any longer gain the biomedical benefits that come from experimenting on them. So a utilitarian says, as you may remember, that the right thing is whatever creates the most overall happiness. You could say that if we include the animal's pain and pleasure in the utilitarian calculation, as Singer does, that weighs heavily against using animals. On the other hand, there might be some that think if you take the total view of how much benefit comes from using the animals, it's still more total benefit than if we had not used them. That might be someone that rather overstates or emphasizes more the value of whatever we get from using them. Now, finally, in the end, you'll describe your own position on the animal rights. Is it more utilitarian? Is it more Kantian? Or is it a combination of the two? If you're a person who thinks, there's no problem with eating meat because these are dumb animals and they don't have rights like we do because they're lacking membership in the moral community, maybe because they're not persons or because they don't have the ability to enter into contracts. If you have more of that traditional view, then you're probably going to be more like a Kantian, basically. On the other hand, you might be more drawn towards the utilitarian perspective. The utilitarian perspective doesn't necessarily say that animals have rights, but it does say that their capacity for pleasure and pain should be weighed equally to the human capacity for the same. And you might have a combination of the two. You might think on the one hand, the pleasure and the pain of the animals should be taken into consideration, but at the same time, they're still not rational. So we shouldn't appoint them to the same tier of moral significance as we have. And so it's really kind of up to you. I don't know what your view will be, but it'll be informed by the moral perspectives that we've argued about or talked about and the different authors that we've spoken of in this debate. In total, we'll have a number of authors that you can refer to. So there's Singer, who's more on the utilitarian pro-animal side. There's Cohen, who's kind of like an anti-animal utilitarian, but he also integrates some Kantian intuitions when he says that animals lack the ability to understand contracts, and that's why they don't have a membership in the moral community. There's Kant himself, of course, who says that animals lacking in reason and higher thought, language, and so on couldn't possibly be members of the moral community, so they can be used as a means, although we should not be excessively cruel to them, as I was saying before. The author that we have today, which I'll explain, of course, is Tom Regan. Regan's definitely on the pro-animal side, but he's even, I think, a little more of a hard line than Singer, because he says that they have rights. And so Regan is kind of interestingly trying to adopt certain elements of Kantian philosophy, but to use them in a way that Kant didn't intend. So he wants to use the spirit, but maybe not the letter of Kant's ideas. What Regan essentially says is that animals should also be things that we treat in a way that's consistent with the second version of the categorical imperative. So, we should not be using them as a means to our ends. We should treat them instead as ends in themselves. In his view, that's because they're subjects of a life, and he doesn't think that you need to necessarily have rationality or, abstract thought or moral self-governance to be a member of the moral community. You just have to be a thing that has consciousness, that has experiences, that's concerned with your own welfare. So Regan is kind of like a pro-animal Kantian. He says that he agrees with the categorical imperative insofar as it says that there are beings that we should not treat as an end. That we should not treat as a means. But in his view, it's not like just humans. He thinks that animals also should qualify as members of the moral community. And if you follow his view, then that means that we could not use animals for our purposes, even if it generated a lot of utilitarian value. So Singer's view is a little more, at least willing to grant some use of animals. Like if we, for example, consumed only meat that came from cruelty-free sources of slaughter and animal rearing, then that would bypass the concerns that he has, because he's only talking about their susceptibility to pain and the fact that they can suffer. So if they were not made to suffer and they were like painlessly slaughtered, then they would be okay from Singer's view. Like if you're buying these like kind of more boutique, expensive kind of meats or eggs or dairy, where the animals involved in the process didn't get exposed to such cruel and factory farm conditions, then Singer would be okay with that, because it's not that he says they have exactly equal rights. It's just that where they have the same kind of interest, they should be given the same weight. And it's the interest in avoiding pain that he specifies. So all those different views are on the table. We're also going to read later on Marianne Warren. She kind of has a sort of partially Kantian view. She thinks also that animals may have some rights, but they're not as strong as ours because of their lack of awareness and their lack of intelligence. So they may have rights of the same kind of content, but often they are weaker in strength. So that means they're easier to override through utilitarian considerations. And then one last author we'll talk about is Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton is also pretty much a straightforward Kantian on the animal issue. He says that animals lack reason and therefore they may be used as a means. But he does say this. He says that there's three kinds of animal to human relationships that involve special norms. And he talks about animals being used as pets, animals that are just being raised in factory farms, and then animals that are in the wild. And he thinks that wild animals, farm animals, and pet animals, depending on which relation we stand into them, there are different norms that structure those various relationships. So that's like his nuance. Anyway, then, that's just me kind of giving you some thought as to the prompt and giving you some basic guidance. As before, where do I side on the animal issue, Jimin? I mean, I'm not a straight up, I don't believe that animals have the same exact rights as humans for reasons similar to Kant. So in that sense, I guess I could be considered somewhat favorable to the Kantian perspective, since they lack reason, autonomy, higher thought. They would, I say, be things that don't have the same standing as a human. If it was a forced choice scenario between slaughtering a human and an animal, I would have to say that the human's life holds greater value and weight. So I don't think they have rights exactly equivalent to ours, but at the same time, their capacity for pain is something that I think is important and that we should respect. So maybe I am a little bit on the sort of like Singer side of things, where I think that we should try our best to desist from consumer purchases of animal products that were derived through suffering. But I don't think that people who eat meat are doing the same thing on a par with like violating human rights. So I guess that's kind of my view. I'm a little bit in the middle though, because my own diet is like I don't really eat meat. I mean, I eat fish, I eat eggs, I eat dairy, but I don't eat like beef, chicken, pork, whatever. So I'm a little mixed up, honestly. My own moral feelings on this are a bit mixed. But I think that my primary motive behind it is not to say that animals have rights on par with the human. I am swayed by the Kantian style arguments, but I think I have enough recognition of the capacity for animals to suffer that I don't want to necessarily participate in a process that involves their suffering. So I personally desist from those things. I don't know if I think it's the same kind of thing as insisting that people honor the rights of animals, because I don't believe that they are on the same moral community level as rational persons. In a way, I'm kind of almost consistent between the abortion authors and the animal authors. So, like, remember how Warren said that if you're not a person, like you're just a fetus and you're not a person yet, that's why it's okay to abort the fetus, to kill the fetus. I find that to be a reasonable argument. So I kind of think persons are the holders of rights. That's why when people eat meat, I don't think that they're violating rights per se, because I don't necessarily think the animals have rights since they're not people. But since they can suffer, since they're sentient, I think that that's due some consideration. So I guess that's kind of where I stand. But I still have an open mind. Maybe my views will change in the future, or in the short term. But that's kind of where I'm at for the moment. Anyway, then, and welcome to everybody that's arrived while I was just talking. I was just giving the whole class here a breakdown of some kind of helpful information as you're working on the second paper. But let's continue. I want to make sure we get through our notes as much as we can for today. So let me kind of start off by just, again, re-summarizing the argument from Singer that we've already covered. And then we're moving on today to the second author on the topic, which is Tom Regan for today. Okay, so, and if you hadn't had a chance to watch that video or film that I posted through a link, try to watch it when you can. It's useful, and you can consider it as another text that's therefore, in principle, could be referenced in your paper, as well as the book. One last thing, though. Utilize quotes in the book. Integrate some quotes from the book into your essay. You all have the book since I provided you with a free digital PDF copy. So I do expect for there to be some engagement with the text. This is always a good plagiarism prevention mechanism that us professors like to use, because when you have to use a book, it forces you to not just go online and find things that you didn't write or that were not generated by you. So I want that granular level of attention to the actual textbook and class notes. So do integrate some quotes when they're useful to illustrate support from the text for your overall analysis of the different authors. Okay, and when you do it, all you got to do, as I said for the first essay, is enclose whatever quotation inside of quotation marks, and at the end of the quoted passage, give me the page number in parentheses. There's no need for a separate works cited or bibliography, because we're all working off of the same book, so that's just a thing to keep in mind too. Okay, so anyway, then back to the Singer, just in summary. He in his paper argues that we should live by the equal consideration principle. The principle of equal consideration says that you should give you should give equal weight to the like interests of all those affected by your actions. This concept of equal consideration of like interests is what has been needed to enforce and to stand up all notions of human equality. Like, for example, to eliminate racism or sexism, you have to recognize that if a person which has a different race or a different gender than you has the same interests as you, then you should give it the same weight as your own, or the same weight you would give to members of your own category. But if you thought that, like, well, a woman's pain doesn't matter as much as a man's, or a black person's pain doesn't matter as much as a white person's, this is bigoted, this is discriminatory, that would be to engage in discrimination on the basis of either race or sex. So he extends that to the case of animals, where we do have the same interests. We don't have all the same interests as animals. There's no animal in the world that's interested in voting or practicing some religion, but they do have at least an interest in avoiding pain and suffering, and we have that interest too. So he thinks that we should grant the same kind of respect and deference to the animal's interest in avoiding pain and suffering as we would for humans. He says if we didn't do that because we thought they're just of low intelligence, he finds that to be just as wrong as saying, well, there's some humans that have low intelligence, like maybe the severely cognitively disabled, and we wouldn't say of them that we can use them for food or for medical experiments if they weren't, willing to agree to it. And so, anybody that says the lack of intelligence on the behalf of the animal is what makes them the legitimate subjects of these treatments, he says that's blocked by the intuition that there are some humans that have a similar level of cognitive sophistication or lack thereof. He considers different objections to the view, like how do we know the animals feel pain? That's an easy objection to dismiss. It's clear and obvious that animals could feel pain. Obviously, just from the observable behavior they have when they're exposed to painful stimuli, where they try to avoid it and they cry out and wail and scream in pain. But then there's also the more biologically based knowledge that we have that they feel pain because they have a central nervous system and it functions in a way parallel to our own. There's the Ben Franklin objection that he talked about, which was the point that, animals eat each other, so why can't we eat them? But he tries to rebut that objection by saying that it's not a proper analogy because the animals, like, they can't literally survive without eating other animals in the cases where they're carnivorous. But humans can, of course, and do survive easily without the use of flesh of other animals to support their nutrition or survival. He also thinks it's a bit inconsistent for people to say, well, we're so different from the animals, that's why we can eat them because we're smart and they're not. Emphasize the differences to justify the unequal treatment. But then on the other hand, sometimes to emphasize the way we're the same. Oh, well, we're all just animals, right? If they eat each other, then shouldn't we? So is it okay to eat animals because they're not as smart as us, meaning they're different from us? Or is it okay to eat the animals because we're all the same as the animals? Just they eat each other and therefore we should do it too. Whether it was tool use, the ability to manipulate language, long-range future planning, special human-type relationships, he says you could argue that some animals don't have those abilities, but even if that was true and it could be contested, why would that make a difference to their capacity to suffer pain? Once again, there are humans that also lack some of those same capacities, and we don't disqualify them as members of the moral community on that basis alone. He knows that some people won't like the stated comparison between non-human animals and, like, say, low-intelligence human beings. The attempt to try and distinguish between the two cases, though, he seems to find faulty. You might say that humans that are of low intelligence, like the severely mentally disabled, the reason that they have a higher moral standing than the animals that have the same level of intelligence is because they're still members of the right kind of species. They're still members of a generally rational species, even if they don't seem to possess that overall quality. But he thinks that's a wrong objection because it sounds like saying we should judge people not on their individual identity, but rather on the basis of their membership in some kind of larger group or category. And that's generally thought to be wrong. If I said, I'm just going to judge you based on the fact that you're a woman or the fact that you're a person with a certain race or that you're from a certain country, it wouldn't really be fair. It'd be just assimilating you to the treatment of a whole category, but you're a unique individual. So he thinks that the basis for that distinction between the human and the low intelligence human and the animal is invalid. There's another point to try and distinguish between the two, saying we should feel favorable towards members of our own species because it's necessary to instill within us the proper kind of sentiments towards them. But he finds that to be a defective objection too, because it emphasizes too much the value of feelings in assigning our moral obligations. And if you just went based off feelings, there are going to be some people who care more about, like, their pet bird than their human neighbor. And if that's not a good idea in that case, then he thinks it's just as wrong in the case where people say we have greater attachments to humans than to animals. And then there's the slippery slope thing. He says some people will say, please don't invite a comparison between low intelligence humans and animals, because if we thought they were on a moral par, then we would start to descend into cruel and inhumane treatment to the low intelligence humans. But he says that's getting his argument exactly wrong, because he doesn't intend for us to see the comparison between humans that are of low intelligence and animals as a basis to downgrade the treatment of those low intelligence humans, but rather to see the similarities between the two cases as a basis for upgrading the treatment of animals to the current levels of treatment that we apply toward the non-human animals. Sometimes people talk about, isn't it natural for us to eat meat? And I mean, arguably we could say that if we're omnivorous, but when you look at true carnivores in nature, they have a whole different sort of physiological structure and anatomical structure than us. For example, they've got like talons, they've got like claws. Often if you look at their mouth and their teeth, it's like full of sharp incisors like you'd see in like predatory carnivores. Humans, if you just look at us, we don't have like any kind of natural appendages or body parts that enable us to be lethal. And so we instead have to just subdue animals with the complex, tools and so on that we've developed with our high cognitive sophistication. But it's at least objectionable to point out whether or not humans were like made to eat meat. Certainly the higher primates that we've descended from, they are omnivorous, but they don't just exclusively eat meat either. So anyways, let's keep going. We have another author then for today. After today's meeting, we'll transition next week into the anti-animal side of the whole debate. So we just got one more author that's kind of obviously on the pro-animal position, and this is Tom Regan. Regan was in the film that you guys watched. He actually recently passed away a few years ago, so rest in peace to him. But he's just another author. His paper is called The Case for Animal Rights. So it's a pretty straightforward title. He's making a case that animals have rights, and that's the paper, what it's called. This paper originally came out in, am I going to get the right date? Case for Animal Rights from 1995. Okay. So Tom Regan, American philosopher, writes this paper from 1995. So let me give you a big overview of his argument, and then we'll get into the details of it. But in general, he says that animals have rights. And that's going beyond the more minimal idea that they just have moral status. Think it have moral status, which means you have some level of consideration that you have to extend to it, but that would still be consistent with saying it lacks the same full-blown rights that we have. But Regan's going all the way. He's saying animals, non-human animals that we use for meat, for fur, for leather, they have rights, he says. And that means that we can't justify any practices used on them that treat them in ways that would not be acceptable to do to a human too. So he doesn't think that they should be able to be used as mere resources for human purposes. They should be given the dignity and respect that we grant to other humans, which also hold rights. Now, what's the basis of having rights? Well, some authors have said you got to be a person. Some people have said you've got to be able to enter into contracts to be a member of the moral community with rights. Some have said that you've got to be able to use language or have tool use, or there's all kinds of different bases, but they all kind of center around some intellectual sophistication or abilities. To Regan, there's a much more basic concept as to what gives something rights. So Regan says, I'm going to put this in the chat. So here's what I wrote in the chat. This is his view. Regan says that what is needed in order to have rights, to be a member of the moral community, you might say, it's nothing about being cognitively advanced. It's not, reason, language, tool use. It's none of those things that we as adult humans have, at least ordinarily. Instead, it's just being the subject of a life. So that's his terminology and phrase. As long as you're the subject of a life, that's it. You should be entitled to having rights and being a member of the moral community on that basis alone. The subject of a life, what is it exactly? I'll try and give you a little bit of a more formal definition of it. So all that it takes to have a subject of a life is this basic thing: to have consciousness, consciousness, the ability to perceive, having perception, like the five senses: sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell. Me and you have consciousness. That's why you're able to watch this. Unlike the marker that I'm holding in my hand, inanimate object, no consciousness at all. Sentience is just another kind of synonym in a way for consciousness, but sentience emphasizes the ability to feel things. So if you're a conscious being, you're a sentient being. If you have a concern with your own welfare and well-being, then you're a subject of a life just on that simple basis alone. And he argues that anything that's the subject of a life, not just anything that's cognitively advanced, not just anything that can talk or read or know about world history, that's not the prerequisite to being a thing that has rights. Instead, it's just being the subject of a life, and that's what he argues. Now, anything that's the subject of a life, he says, has inherent moral value. And I now need to make a point and describe for you what it means to have inherent moral value as opposed to having what's called instrumental value. So two types of value. So 2 types of value that a thing can have. Number 1 is, let's just start with instrumental value. So instrumental value means a thing has this kind of value, but only insofar as it's useful to others, only so far as it serves a purpose or some good for another being. So you see this marker right here, right? Well, before I even give you the example of the marker, hold on, let me hold myself. I'm going to wait till I define both kinds of value, and then we'll get to other examples of discussion about it. So instrumental value, it's not valuable in itself. It's not valuable on its own terms. It's just valuable as a thing to be used as, like, say, an instrument, hence the phrase instrumental. It's just valuable insofar as it's a tool or an instrument for others to utilize. If it didn't have the ability to benefit others or to serve some purpose for them, then it would lack any kind of inherent value. But that is the difference between instrumental and inherent value. So now we're going to learn what is inherent value. So inherent value, when something has inherent value, then it has value within itself without reference to necessarily its value or utility to any other being or any other thing. Now, back to the marker. So you see this marker, there's some value that the marker has. It's obviously an instrument for writing. It has value to me because it allows me to write things on a whiteboard like that. But notice that the marker, it only has instrumental value. It's not considered valuable for its own sake. So suppose that this marker can no longer write, as eventually it's destined to run out of ink. When it runs out of ink, should I keep it in my possession, protect it from destruction, and ensure that it maintains a comfortable existence? No. You already know that when this thing's out of ink, it's time to do what? Question, just let me know in the chat if you can follow my thought process here. Yes, throw it in the trash, just get rid of it, because its value is exhausted once it no longer serves any practical purpose for anybody, right? It's got some limited minor value just as a writing utensil, but if it can no longer serve the function of writing because it doesn't have ink in it, then it's got no value and there's no reason to keep it. It's only valuable insofar as it serves this practical purpose to me, assisting me with writing. But then how about me and you? Do we only have instrumental value? No. We think that when a person, let's suppose, doesn't have any potential to, like, promote anyone's well-being. Let's talk about, for example, a person who suffered a terrible injury and they've now become permanently disabled. So they can no longer walk. Maybe they've become paralyzed from, like, the waist or maybe even neck down, depending on the case. So they no longer have motor control, or at least not full motor control of their body. They can't work a job. They can't, serve the economy or whatever by, like, producing capital for anybody. With that human being that no longer can perform tasks or, do helpful things for others in that sort of way, should they just be destroyed? Should we maybe just use them as a medical test subject to determine the effect of certain drugs because they're not, leading to any important results for other people? Obviously not. We think that a human being has value regardless of whether or not they're useful to anyone else. A homeless person living on Skid Row, may have no contribution to the economy or to anyone's welfare, but we don't say of that person, well, let's just go and take their organs out and use them for transplants for the other people that are productive members of society. So, a human being, we think, if anything, is something that has inherent value. It's not only valuable because it's useful to anyone else. A human, we think, is valuable in and of themselves, even if they actually have no ability to serve anyone else's purposes at all. Does that make sense to you guys? As a human, I hope you would be able to embrace this thought, at least about yourself, have a little bit of sense of the dignity and importance of the human race. Not to worry, Rosemary, thank you. So the author here is just trying to extend this concept of inherent value to animals. He thinks the kind of things that hold the status of having inherent value should be things that are alive, not just things that are smart, not just things that have the ability to watch this lecture or to read philosophy or to even do more basic things that are intellectually robust. Instead, it's just being the subject of a life that should qualify something as a member of a moral community that has inherent value. So all who have inherent moral worth have it equally. If I have inherent moral value and so do you, we cannot say that I have more than you or less than you. If I have a higher degree than you, or if I have more money or something than another person, that does not give me more inherent value than that other person. All who have inherent value have it equally. So obviously we have inherent value and rights. So he thinks that animals have it too. And if we do have those kind of standards that we apply, not just to ourselves, but to animals, then that means that we could not easily set aside those rights for some utilitarian reason. So as a handy way of thinking about the moral outlook of Regan on the animals, he basically is going to say that if something would be wrong to do to a human, it would also be wrong to do to any animal. So if it would be wrong to hold a human in captivity for the sake of using them for milk or for eggs, that would be wrong to do to an animal too, because it would be just treating them again like they're just something that produces something of value to others. But we should be respecting these things that are the subjects of a life on their own terms, not just as commodities, not just as resources to utilize, not just as things to have some kind of instrumental value associated with it, but rather inherent value. So if we were to agree with his conclusions or his reasoning, then it would require radical changes to the status quo. He says that we should not eat, hunt, dissect, abuse, experiment on animals in any way, shape, or form. We should not be doing research on them. We should not be using them as farm animals. If we don't treat them with those standards, he says, then we'd be violating their rights and assuming that they're only valuable insofar as they're resources to be utilized by us. And it's wrong to think of humans as just resources to be utilized by others. He thinks the same is true of the animals. In a way similar to Singer, he does say that to exclude them from the moral community based on their low intelligence would be just as wrong as if we did that to similar humans with low intelligence. The low intelligence humans have rights, and we regard them as having inherent value, even though they can't really do anything that contributes to the benefit of others. And he thinks the same is true of these animals too, that have the same kinds of cognitive capacities. So that's the overview of the Regan, and there's just some more details to fill in, but I'm trying to give you the big picture as we go through it. So anyway, the case for animal rights. He starts off and he says something very bold. He says that if animals have rights, then we need to not just reform, not just modify our practices with respect to animals, but instead completely abolish whole avenues of interaction with them. That we should abolish all animal research, all animal agriculture, and all hunting. This is taking a harder line than others that are on the pro-animal side of the debate, because some that are more utilitarian in their thinking argue that as long as they don't suffer excessive pain, it's okay to do things with them that don't impose pain. That's consistent with using them as resources as long as the pain isn't a factor. But to Regan, this is not going far enough. If you're using an animal on a farm, let's say we're milking a cow, taking its milk, or we're taking the eggs away from the chicken, even if these chickens or cows are made to live in comfortable farms, not factory farms, where there's spacious land for them to roam around on or graze on, they're not harmed or exposed to painful stimuli, he thinks that would still be wrong because it's still using the animal as an instrument or tool or resource for human utilization. So he's not saying that agriculture for animals, using animals, is okay if it's traditional instead of factory farm, or that research is okay if it's really, really vitally important. To him, you can't change an unjust institution just by tidying it up or by making some adjustments or alterations to it. When you have an unjust institution, when it's a violation of justice, he thinks the only right way to change that is to totally abolish it. As an example, you know how segregation used to be a thing in our country, the slavery, of course, too, but focusing on segregation for the moment. What they tried to do at first with segregation was, it was such an entrenched idea that like blacks and whites, they shouldn't mix and they should not live in integrated societies together. So for a while, after some of these Jim Crow laws started to fall, they were like, well, how about separate but equal? Let's just make sure that the segregated institutions are equal and fully funded. But it's still wrong, like you can't fix the problem of segregated institutions by just giving more money to both sides and making sure that they have a comfortable segregated institution, because it's still based on a fundamentally unjust principle, which is that people of different races shouldn't be mixing, or that somehow we should have divisions between people and not allow them to integrate. That's the fundamental flaw in that whole institution or concept. So in the case of segregation, you wouldn't fix the problem by just creating more equality in the segregated institutions. And so he says the same is true of our practices with respect to animals. You can't fix the fundamental injustice involved in that by just giving them more land to graze on, or making their farm environment more comfortable and hospitable to their well-being. Instead, he thinks we have to like radically abolish these institutions, because at the core of them, there's still this unjust assumption that animals ought to be treated as though they're just tools and resources to be used instead of having inherent value. So in his view, the thing that's wrong with the practices we have, it's not just a minor detail, but the whole system itself at its fundamental basis. And the basic wrong, again, is the very idea that animals are resources here for us to manipulate and use at our will, for sport, for taste, and whatever else. So once you accept that animals are just resources, then all the abusive practices that we engage with them on follow as a kind of logical implication. You're never going to give equal weight to a person and the property of the person. If we just think of animals as property to be used by us in whatever way that we like, then we're never going to give them the proper treatment or respect, because we're looking at them as subordinate to us. So anyway, more space, more straw will not eliminate the basic wrong. So in his view, and this is again going beyond Singer, because Singer did say as long as they're not made to suffer, then the practices would be fair enough morally. Regan says it's not enough to just be more humane. If you want to do the right thing, you have to urge the full abolition of these different practices and so on. How to do that is obviously a practical question that it's not easy to answer. But obviously, if there was ever going to be any progress towards the changing status quo concerning our relations to animals, one of the first things that would have to change would be people's minds, because you're never going to be willing to make major reforms to the way we live or the way we interact with animals if you don't think that there's any kind of moral requirement to do it. So he, as a philosopher, thinks that he can make at least this contribution to that change, writing an essay like this, having some academic influence over some people to make them at least contemplate or take a little more seriously whether the current status quo is unjust. So next, he considers how the moral status of animals has been understood by those that deny animal rights. So his next move in the paper is that he's going to try and talk about what his opponents will say as to why they claim animals don't have rights, and then he'll try to contend with their views. Some people advance the ideas that I was kind of mentioning that Kant has, that we'll explore in further detail on Tuesday. But some people hold Kant's view that we don't have any direct duties to animals since they lack reason. At best, we may have indirect duties to them. According to that view, you really can't directly do wrong to an animal. It's sort of like, take the example of your car, okay? Suppose if I go up to your car, I would never do this, obviously, but it doesn't need to be me in the example. Suppose that somebody goes up to your car and they like break the windshield, with a hammer or a bat or whatever. Now, that's wrong, isn't it? I think we can agree on that. But is it wrong because of the harm done to the windshield? Not really, because the windshield doesn't have any moral standing of its own. It's just an inanimate object. We can say it's wrong, but the reason it's wrong is because the windshield is something that a person owns. And so what you're really doing harm to is the person and their interests, not the interests of the windshield directly. Some people think that this is the right metaphor to use to talk about the way we ought to treat animals. So if somebody has a pet and they love this animal and it's theirs as like their property, then of course it would be wrong to do anything harmful to that animal, but not for the animal's own sake, because it's just a dumb animal. It's for the sake of the owner that has a vested interest in it. So these kind of subtle, indirect duty views, some animals may have some proper treatment owed to them, but not on their own account, merely because they are the objects of value to people that we should show indirect respect for. He doesn't agree with that. He says, why believe that animals are only worthy of indirect moral standing if they are the things valued by people? Why believe that, he says? You can't think it's because the animals don't have feelings. The windshield, fair enough. There's no windshield in the world or other like inanimate object that we can say has rights intrinsic to itself. But an animal can feel things. So he thinks that any attempt to try and compare or assimilate the case of the animal to property is wrong on its face because it ignores the obvious difference between property that's like just inanimate objects like cars or whatever, and then living things that can feel, that have the ability for pain and pleasure. No intelligent person thinks that animals don't have feelings. You could say only human pain matters, but just like Singer argued, he says that's totally unreasonable. Pain is bad, and you know it because you can feel it. So if it's wrong to cause pain to you, he thinks it would be wrong to do it to an animal as well. More sophisticated indirect duty thinkers may have appealed to a different justification known as contractarianism. And I just remind you again of this. We talked about it briefly earlier in the unit on the animals, but some people that are opposed to Regan's type of argument give contractarianism as their basis. Yeah, so in contractarianism, so the contractarian view, I just put a brief little blurb definition in the chat about it. Some say this is the reason that they're not on our par and that they don't possess the rights that we and other humans have, because they can't engage in contracts. Some people believe, and they have some interesting arguments to support it, that morality is just a set of rules that we kind of voluntarily agree to abide by. Even if we don't literally sign a contract, there's this kind of unstated social contract that we have with other humans. Essentially, it has the sort of content of, I recognize that I will respect your rights and your entitlements, and in exchange, I want my own rights and entitlements to be honored by other members of the world that are human beings. So, it's kind of like a quid pro quo, if you will. I won't violate your rights and you won't violate mine. But if there's a being that couldn't possibly understand the reciprocity of rights and obligations and duties, like animals, then you could say that they lack standing. They don't have the ability to enter into contracts, so how could they be members of a moral community that's essentially based on some kind of conceptual contract with other people? Animals obviously don't have the ability to think about what a contract specifies, what it provides for them, or what it requires from them. So that means that they are not members of the moral community, so says the contractarian. About the contract, though, and the contractarian idea, if you have the ability to engage in contracts, then you'd be a full member of the moral community on that basis. But of course, there are some that can't engage in contracts, and it could be argued that in those cases, if there are members of the moral community that are contract capable, that value those others, then they could extend indirect moral consideration to those. So, as an example, you've got a pet. The pet can't engage in a contract, but it's your pet, and you are a full member of the moral community that has the ability to comprehend and understand contracts. So it's sort of indirectly pulled into the umbrella of the moral community via you. But there are some animals that nobody has any sentimental or personal attachments to. Farm animals in factory farms, wild animals living in the wild. Those animals are fair game to be used by humans because not only do they lack the ability to engage in contracts, but they also don't even have the indirect coverage in the moral community that would have come from them being the personal, valuable animal to some human with reason. So in that view, animals that no one has any sentimental ties to are not even covered indirectly by the contract parties. So the pain and death they endure for our sake is not wrong because nobody really cares about them, I guess. Regan's view, though, is that contractarian views are incorrect. Regan now tries to push back on this whole contractarian position. And the reason that he finds it wrong is because he thinks that it's wrong even in the way that it applies to humans. So hear me write his criticism of the idea. Regan's critique of contractarianism is that there are also some human beings that cannot engage in contracts. Like, for example, the severely mentally disabled, So he says the contractarian view, the problem is that if you really think about it, it doesn't even cover every human being as a member of the moral community that has rights. In particular, mentally disabled human beings, or maybe certain, severely advanced age, and they're going into senility or dementia, or even like babies that don't yet have the full mastery of rational abilities like language and higher thought. In contractarianism, they don't have their own direct moral standing. Now, you might say, well, but they're still valued by members of the moral community. The mentally disabled individual, the toddler, the senile, demented, elderly person, they may not have any longer or not yet or never will or had the ability to enter into contracts, but they're still like a valuable entity to those that can. But hold on, I mean, what if people didn't care about them? And what if we adopted the standpoint that if you don't have those abilities, we actually don't care much about what is done to you? We could imagine then a situation in which even humans would be capable of being used for like abhorrent biomedical experiments against their will, as long as they couldn't enter into contracts. So he says the contractarian approach is dangerous. It invites abuses. It's not something that we can only relegate to the animal world without having the spillover implications as to how it might harm or endanger even humans that we generally do assume shouldn't be used as mere instruments or tools. So anyway, the contractarian approach says morality depends on a kind of general agreement, and since people could in theory agree to strange exclusions of some people or whole categories of people, it could not rule out blatant forms of injustice. Now, he does a little sidebar about a sort of subtle variation of the contractarian view. So he briefly talks about this, and I just want to mention it in passing. There's an author named John Rawls. He's probably one of the most well-known 20th century philosophers who talked a lot about the philosophy of law and ethics. He has a book called The Theory of Justice, which is a classic in philosophy. It's one of the big, probably most well-known and famous ethics books of the 20th century. In his book, he talks about the concept of the veil of ignorance. So let me explain that. So Rawls, in his book Theory of Justice, he discussed this issue of what would be needed in order to make sure that people forming the rules for society, like the laws or the constitutional documents, what would be needed to make sure that they would make that society free and just? How could they make sure that the society that they were erecting was one that was fair? He says the way to do that requires a philosophical thought experiment. He says, suppose that we could place those that are framing the rules of the society behind a so-called veil of ignorance. Now, this veil of ignorance concept is a hypothetical construct, but here's what we imagine. That if the people who are making the rules for society have the veil of ignorance placed on them, then once the veil is put on, they're deprived of all knowledge about their identity and anything whatsoever relating to their identity. So they no longer know when the veil of ignorance is applied. They don't know what gender they are. They don't know what race they are. They don't know what, profession or wealth that they have, right? So they're denied all personal facts as to their own identity. And there's no way to actually induce this, because it would be like basically giving someone the equivalent of not just amnesia, but even deeper than that. You'd just be like, wait, what race am I? What age am I? What income and wealth status do I have? What gender am I? So you'd be denied all those facts or characteristic pieces of information. Now he says, if the veil of ignorance was applied to people and they had to make the rules for society with the veil on them, then they would be sure to make the fairest rules possible. Can anybody that's hearing me maybe offer a thought as to how the veil of ignorance could contribute to a fair system of rules? Because if you didn't know who you were when the veil was removed, then you wouldn't want to create any rules that caused, well, let's see if you can put the idea forward. If you didn't know who you were at all and you were tasked with the idea of making rules, there'd be no labels. Yes, there'd be no labels. So it wouldn't be like you'd be able to make the rules for society with an intention to benefit your own category, right? Now, suppose that I was a man, and I am a man, but suppose I was a sexist man, and I was the one that was responsible for creating the rules in a society. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to give all the power to men because I know I'm one of them. So that'll be a great society to live in. But if I didn't know at all whether I was going to be a man or a woman, and I'm like in this state of total like ignorance as to that fact, then I'd have to be careful, right? Because if I wrote the rules that said men have all the power and women can't vote, da 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 da, then if the veil was removed and I was like, oh damn, I'm a woman actually, then I would have created rules that were disadvantageous to me. So the veil of ignorance is supposed to be something that like prevents you from applying bias and favoritism to your own case when you construct these rules that are necessary for the establishment of society. You might argue that the only reason that, like, say, in the Constitution, it originally said that slaves, are only considered 3/5 of a person is because the people framing the Constitution knew that they were not slaves. If you didn't know, though, whether you would be free or enslaved, or if you would be white or black or whatever, then you wouldn't want to write those rules into the system because you'd be like, if this veil is removed and I end up being in the disadvantaged group, then it's going to be bad for me. So it's a way of trying to make sure that your self-interest, kind of commits you to creating a fair system of rules and principles. Anyway, so if this veil of ignorance was to be used, some people say that that would actually be a reasonable way to institute the rules of society, and that this could somehow be another kind of instance of a contractarian view because, we would ensure that there's people making rules that are fair. But he doesn't like this either. He says, Regan says, that even in the veil of ignorance, kind of more sophisticated articulation of a contractarian idea, it still can't rule out the exclusion of rights to some people that are lacking in reason. Because if you have the veil of ignorance on, you would still know that you're rational enough to establish rules. So you could still imagine the contract parties creating rules that would be harmful to, those that can't engage in contracts, like the severely cognitively disabled. So kind of taking stock of where we're at here, Regan believes animals have rights. He's trying to engage with those that deny this and have some basis to deny or disqualify them from having rights. Contractarian views, he finds fault with them. This is one view, though, that tries to deny animal rights because it says lacking in the capacity to enter into contracts, they don't have rights because that's a prerequisite for having rights. He says that's a bad view because who's to say that contracts couldn't be agreed to by people that would exclude certain members of the moral community that ought to be included? Then the Rawlsian type of veil of ignorance idea is put forward. Well, wouldn't the contract itself be fair and would make sure to not incorporate any kind of unfair exclusions of certain categories of people? Because if you had the veil of ignorance on, you'd be sure to make sure that you didn't, like, say, exclude the rights of women or, people of a certain racial category or a certain kind of socioeconomic attainment. But here again, he says, not so fast. Even though you couldn't necessarily discriminate on the basis of race, sex, class, you'd still know as a member of the contracting parties that you had reason, and therefore you could still write into the rules certain exclusions of rights for the non-rational, like the mentally disabled. So that's why he finds that to be problematic too. Another attempt to justify animals not having rights, but humans having rights, is what he calls the cruelty-kindness view. So let me try and explain and tell you what that view is all about. So some would try to say that they don't have rights per se, but we should at least be able to stand up some basic moral obligations to them. And this is what he calls or refers to as the cruelty-kindness view. So some would say, don't call animals holders of rights, but instead, can we at least say minimally that you should be kind to them and you should not be cruel to them? Just try to be kind and not cruel. And as long as you hold to that standard, then it's not like animals need rights. They just need to be treated kind and not cruel. The cruelty-kindness view. It says we have a direct duty to be kind and not cruel to them. Here again, though, Regan kind of dismisses this one pretty quickly. He says the cruelty-kindness view is not strong enough because just being kind and not cruel to others is not enough information to know that you're doing the morally right thing. A person could be kind, for example, but still be like racist. They could be kind to people that are members of their fellow race, but not otherwise. And in that case, they're not really being just and moral, even if they do exhibit kindness in their everyday interactions. Maybe they live in a racially homogenous neighborhood where they never get to express cruel viewpoints or treat people cruelly because they just don't interact with them. But here again, you see it's not necessarily enough to make sure that they're reaching the right moral standard of equity. Also, some people can not be cruel but still do something that's wrong. If you thought that abortion was wrong, you might say that the physician that provides the service is taking care not to be cruel or to impose pain, but you could still argue that this is wrong because of some fundamental violation of the rights of the unborn. So just being kind doesn't entail that what you're doing is right. Just avoiding cruelty does not necessarily entail that what you're doing is right. So he sets that view to the side as well. Another anti-rights view is utilitarianism itself. And that's kind of like how Peter Singer had argued. Peter Singer, even though he's a friend of the animals, he does say that animals don't have the same rights as humans because they lack some of the same interests that we have. When the interests are in common, like the interest in avoiding pain, they should be given equal treatment to the human interest in the same. But lacking in some interests that we have, they don't have exactly similar rights. But to Regan, even utilitarianism does not go far enough because utilitarians place moral value on the feeling of happiness, but not on the being that has the feeling of happiness. So Regan has a critique of utilitarianism now. I want to tell you a little bit about it. And again, why are we talking about his critique of utilitarianism? I want to be as clear as possible. It's because if you're a utilitarian, you would not assert that animals have rights. You would say they're capable of pain and pleasure, and that should be weighed equally to the capacity for pain and pleasure that other beings have. But that's consistent with denying that they have rights on par with like a right to life or a right to not be subjected to treatment that uses like their milk or eggs for human resources. So he doesn't like that either because it's falling short of extending full-on rights to the animals on par with our own. And here's why he finds fault with utilitarianism theoretically on a basic level. So Regan's critique of utilitarianism. Utilitarian ethical theory only places importance on maximizing the feeling of happiness as much as possible. But it does not place any importance or value on the being itself, which has the capacity for the feelings of happiness. And this is wrong, he says. As an example of this, he gives an example of a cup holding certain liquid, okay? So I'm going to try and give you this analogy that he gives. Cup with liquid. Okay, so suppose that we have here a cup, and in the cup there's a certain volume of liquid, like say that right there. I'm asking you to imagine this cup as like, well, let's go with the liquid first. Let's suppose that the liquid is a metaphor for happiness and pleasure. So this thing is a container that can contain the happiness, right? The more liquid that is filled, the more happiness that exists within this cup. The less liquid that's filled, the less happiness that there is. Now, in utilitarianism, what's the important thing? Is it the liquid or the cup? Is it the feeling of happiness or is it the thing that's holding it? All that's really cared about in the theory is maximizing what? Or caring or valuing what thing? Well, no. The cup is the person, let's say by metaphoric analogy. Yes, so the cup is the thing that holds it, but both of you guys are wrong. The cup is not itself the thing that's vested with value by the utilitarian. All that matters is maximizing as much total quantity of the liquid as possible because it says do whatever is necessary to maximize as much happiness and pleasure as possible. So suppose that we could break this cup itself. And by doing that, it would cause other cups to increase the total volume of liquid that they had more than what this one had. Okay? If that was possible, The utilitarian would say, go ahead and break the cup, because we don't care about the cup per se. We just care about maximizing the grand total of happiness that all the cups can hold. So that's kind of like on par with saying, let's just kill one person, use their organs to save 5 others. But that shows that we don't actually care about the person themselves intrinsically. We only care about them as a source of pleasure. Their pleasure matters, but if exterminating and eliminating it will result in more total pleasure going forward for all the others, then the utilitarian would say, this is not of the most essential first importance. It's maximizing the feeling of happiness that the cup holds within that matters to the greatest extent. And Jasmine, the liquid, more liquid means more people happy. Well, more liquid means more happiness possessed by the container. But if the whole container can be like literally destroyed and broken into bits, and because of that, other cups increase their total volume to a degree that exceeds what this could have held, then the utilitarian has no firm basis to say what's wrong with destroying that cup. So it's a metaphor. It's not a perfect metaphor, but the cup is like analogous to a person, and the liquid within is the amount of happiness that it could hold. And all that's really important to a utilitarian is maximizing that happiness stuff. But it doesn't place essential value on the beings which could have the happiness. Now, don't you think that we should value the people that are the subjects that can experience happiness or not, and not just the maximization of the feelings that they have? He gives another example to make the same point. And we're running low on time, so I may have to finish up these last few comments as we begin on Tuesday. But let me at least try to set it up for you. Another example that he gives to make the same point is a case involving a hypothetical character called Aunt B. All right, Aunt B. So I want you to imagine that there's this person, there's this aunt, right? There's an aunt, and her name is B. But here's the thing with Aunt B. She's really not nice. You know, nobody likes her. She's mean. She's rude. She's nasty to people, and so she's not causing anyone any happiness at all. To the contrary, she's annoying, mean-spirited, and just not nice. Suppose furthermore that she has a nephew, and this nephew would stand to gain a lot of wealth if something was to happen and she died. He would be the beneficiary of her estate, and then it would all be transferred over to him. Now, suppose that if she were to die within a short time frame, then the will exist in that way, and the nephew will receive all the money. And she's thinking of changing the will to write him out of the inheritance, let's say in a couple weeks. Now, if she dies before that time period where she changes the will, not only will the money go to the nephew, but let's suppose that this nephew is going to use the money to cause a lot of human happiness for others. So what he'll end up doing is, spending it on, housing the homeless, or curing cancer, or like building a children's hospital in the third world, improving people's lives, making their lives better, preventing them from suffering to a great extent. So if you're just a pure hardcore utilitarian, it's hard to say why maybe the nephew shouldn't just kill Aunt B, because if he does, there's going to be a lot more total happiness in the world than there would be if he didn't do that. If he doesn't kill her and she gets to change the will, let's suppose the will now say, I want all my money to go to a very expensive casket. This is going to be a diamond encrusted casket, and that's the way I want to get buried. Now, I'm embellishing the case a little bit. I'm just adding a couple of extra details to make it easier for you to access and understand and tap into. But the point here, I hope you understand, is pretty straightforward. Like, that would be wrong, wouldn't it? It would be wrong to kill her for the sake of getting more total happiness in the world, even though she's nasty, even though she's making no one happy, even though the world would probably be happier without her there, because there'd be all this transfer of wealth that would then, create a lot of benefits for other people that otherwise wouldn't happen. Don't you still feel like it's wrong to do that to her just because she's a living thing? It doesn't matter how much total happiness could be created by destroying her life, because fundamentally it's wrong to violate the rights of a person, or in Regan's view anyway, the subject of a life. So he thinks that utilitarianism is getting all these cases wrong, that it's overlooking what is essentially important morally. It's not just the feeling of happiness, but it is the beings that are alive that can feel the happiness or pain that we should really place ultimate value and concern on. So the Aunt B example and the cup example are just two different ways to get insight into his thinking as to why utilitarianism, despite its massive influence, is actually fundamentally wrong. That's why Regan is much more partial to the Kantian outlook, except he deviates from Kant in the letter of Kant's ideas, because Kant was specific that he didn't think animals had rights. But Regan kind of wants to appropriate an aspect of Kant's thought, which is that we shouldn't treat others as a means. It's just that let me finish with this last question to you. Regan thinks that we shouldn't treat others as means, but it's not based around just humans. Instead, we shouldn't treat who as a means, according to Regan. He tries to apply the second version of the categorical imperative, but more broadly, not merely to humans or rational beings, but rather to just anything that is, well, you say animals, yes, but to use the terminology mentioned earlier, it's anything that's the subject of a life, which of course includes the animals. So he thinks Kant was right to a point. He was right that there are some things that are entitled to respect and consideration that should hold rights and not be treated as a means, except he thought that he was wrong on the basis that he assigned to that status, which is, being a person or a human. Instead, for Regan, that principle should be held towards just subjects of life generally. So there's just a little bit of leftover stuff. I think I got through most everything on Regan. We'll turn our attention on Tuesday to the more anti-animal side of these debates, where we'll hear from authors that do say that they don't have rights and that the current treatment and status quo that we live with is actually morally justified and reasonable and fair. But that's for Tuesday. So until then, I'm just going to let you guys go. If you don't mind, just go ahead and let me know that you're signing out and we can say bye. And then if you need me for anything at all, if you're working on your papers and we get closer to the due date or whenever, you can always send me out your version. I'm happy to look at it, give you comments back, but that's just on an individual case-by-case basis. All right? So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate all of your attendance and your great comments. And I'll definitely be seeing you next time on Tuesday, okay? So, yes, feelings are not a reliable pathway to truth, Greg. Interesting comment, and I agree. That's something that Regan's definitely saying. Okay, guys, take care once again, and see you soon.